It was a cold autumn evening in late October, and the narrow highway winding through Colorado's San Juan Mountains was empty, save for my old truck and the moonlight reflecting off the snow-dusted peaks. I had just finished a long shift at the mill and was heading home to Montrose, counting the miles until I could collapse into bed. As I rounded a bend, my headlights picked out a lone figure standing on the shoulder of the road, his hand raised in a hitchhiker's gesture. He was tall and lanky, wrapped in a long coat with a backpack slung over one shoulder. Despite the late hour and the eerie isolation of the highway, I felt a pang of sympathy. It was freezing out there, and the next town was miles away. I slowed the truck and pulled over. He approached quickly, his movements smooth and deliberate. As he opened the door, I noticed his face was thin, almost gaunt, with hollow cheeks and piercing gray eyes. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice calm and even. "No problem," I replied, motioning for him to hop in. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," he said, tossing his backpack onto the floor and sliding into the seat. We started off again, the silence between us thick and heavy. I tried to strike up a conversation. "Not many people hitchhike these days," I said. "You from around here?" "Not anymore," he answered, his gaze fixed out the window. His vague responses didn't encourage further chat, so I focused on the road. But as the miles passed, I couldn't shake a growing unease. Something about him felt off. The hitchhiker sat rigidly, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't fidget, didn't shift in his seat like most people would on a bumpy mountain road. It was as if he were a statue. Finally, he broke the silence. "You ever pick up hitchhikers before?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying an edge I couldn't place. "Every now and then," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Not too often, though. Gotta be careful these days, you know." He turned to me then, his gray eyes locking onto mine. "Careful," he repeated, almost like he was testing the word. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine despite the heater blasting in the cab. The road narrowed as we climbed higher into the mountains, the trees pressing in closer. The radio crackled with static and I switched it off. The hitchhiker's presence felt heavier with each passing minute, like the air was growing thicker. "Take the next turn," he said abruptly, pointing to a dirt road that branched off into the forest. I hesitated. "That's not the way to Montrose." "I know," he replied, his voice firm. "It's where I need to go." A pit formed in my stomach. The road he pointed to led into the middle of nowhere. No houses, no towns, just wilderness. "Look, I'm happy to drop you off at the next gas station," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat, and my pulse skyrocketed. My grip tightened on the wheel as I braced for the worst. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a map. "Take the turn," he said again, his eyes narrowing. Against my better judgment, I complied. The truck bounced over the uneven dirt road, the headlights casting long shadows through the trees. The hitchhiker unfolded the map, but I couldn't make out any details from my angle. "Just a bit farther," he murmured, more to himself than to me. The road ended in a clearing, and he told me to stop. The engine idled as he sat there, staring into the dark forest ahead. "You can leave now," he said without looking at me. Relief flooded through me, and I reached for the gear shift. But then he added, "Unless you want to see what happens next." His tone was calm, almost inviting, but every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. "I think I'll pass," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. As I shifted into reverse, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could react, he opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the trees. My hands were shaking as I backed out of the clearing, the truck's headlights casting eerie shapes in the woods. As I turned back onto the main road, a figure appeared in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. It was him. I floored the gas pedal, my heart pounding. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching. When I finally reached home, I parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time, trying to calm down. I convinced myself it was over, that he was just some weirdo trying to scare me. But as I stepped out of the truck, I froze. There on the passenger seat was his map. It was open, marked with strange symbols and notes in a language I couldn't read. and scrawled across the top in bold letters were the words, "You'll see me again." I burned the map that night, but it didn't help. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I catch a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. Just for a second before he vanishes. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Two years ago, I was hitchhiking through the Midwest, a sprawling maze of endless highways, abandoned motels, and truck stops that never seemed to close. The trip was my attempt to escape a suffocating city life and find clarity in the open road. I wasn't new to hitchhiking, but what happened that night on a lonely stretch of Kansas highway still makes me question reality. It was late September and the weather had just begun to cool. I was on US 50, a road that cuts straight through the heart of Kansas. Locals call it the loneliest road, and for good reason. The horizon was nothing but empty fields, telephone poles, and the occasional dilapidated barn. I had been walking for hours. Cars were sparse, and those that passed didn't so much as slow down. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the road bathed in moonlight. My legs ached, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass. Finally, a vehicle approached. A beat-up sedan, its headlights dim and one of them flickering. I waved my arm, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible. To my relief, the car slowed and came to a stop a few feet ahead of me. The driver rolled down the passenger window. He was a wiry man, probably in his late 40s, with thin, greasy hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Denver, but anywhere closer will do," I replied. He nodded and gestured to the passenger seat. "Hop in. I'm going as far as Dodge City." Grateful, I climbed into the car, throwing my backpack onto the floor. The interior smelled faintly of gasoline and something else I couldn't quite place. Something sour. The man introduced himself as Carl, and I gave him my name. Carl wasn't much of a talker, which suited me fine. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic bump of tires on asphalt were oddly soothing. For the first half hour we drove in near silence, interrupted only by Carl muttering to himself occasionally. As we passed a particularly desolate stretch of road, I noticed something odd, a figure standing on the shoulder up ahead, illuminated briefly by the car's headlights. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a long coat and wide-brimmed hat. He didn't wave or move as we passed, he just stood there, staring at the car. "Did you see that guy?" I asked, breaking the silence. Carl didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Don't worry about it," he said finally, his tone clipped. His reaction unsettled me, but I let it go. Maybe it was just a local, or someone whose car had broken down. We drove for another hour before I saw another figure on the side of the road. This one was different, a woman this time, her face partially obscured by long, dark hair. She wore a tattered dress that looked out of place in the modern world. I turned to Carl. "That's the second person I've seen out here. You sure we shouldn't stop?" Carl shot me a look, his jaw tight. I said, "Don't worry about it." His tone left no room for argument, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. Why were people just standing out here in the middle of nowhere, seemingly waiting for something? The third time it happened, I didn't even bother pointing it out. The figure was barely visible in the rearview mirror before the darkness swallowed them again. We stopped for gas at a tiny, run-down station just outside a small town. Carl went inside to pay while I stretched my legs and used the restroom. When I came back, Carl was leaning against the car, smoking. "I hope you're not one of those curious types," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "What do you mean?" He looked at me, his expression hard to read in the dim light. "You see things on this road, things you're better off ignoring." Before I could press him for details, he flicked his cigarette away and climbed back into the car. Reluctantly, I followed. We were about 10 miles outside Dodge City when I noticed something in the back seat. It was just a shadow at first, but when I turned to get a better look, my blood ran cold. There was someone sitting there. Carl?" I said, my voice shaking. "Do you have someone else in the car?" Carl didn't answer. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel. "Who's in the back seat?" I pressed, louder this time. Carl finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't turn around again. Don't talk to it. I felt a chill run down my spine. What the hell are you talking about? Just keep your eyes on the road, he snapped. Against my better judgment, I glanced over my shoulder again. The figure was still there, its features indistinct like it was shrouded in mist, but I could feel it watching me, its presence oppressive and cold. Carl's breathing grew ragged and he started muttering under his breath. I could only catch fragments. Shouldn't have picked him up. Always the same, never learns. Suddenly, the figure leaned forward, its face inches from mine. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were black voids, endless and hungry. My heart raced as I whipped my head forward, clutching the edges of my seat. "Make it stop!" I shouted. Carl slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder. "Get out!" he yelled. "What? Get the hell out of my car!" Terrified and confused, I grabbed my backpack and stumbled out onto the roadside. The car sped off before I could say another word, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, unsure of what to do. The road was silent again, the air heavy with a sense of wrongness. Then I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps on gravel. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure from the back seat. It didn't move or make a sound, but I could feel its malevolence radiating toward me. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran, but eventually I saw the lights of a truck stop in the distance. Gasping for air, I stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth. The waitress looked at me with concern. "You okay, honey?" I couldn't find the words to explain. I stayed at that truck stop until sunrise, too afraid to step back outside. When I finally did, I caught a ride with a trucker heading to Denver. I didn't tell him what had happened, and he didn't ask. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't hitchhike anymore. Whatever was on that road, I never want to meet it again. It was late, nearing midnight, when I was heading back from a weekend visit to my brother's cabin near the Appalachian Mountains. The stretch of road was long, isolated, and lined with thick trees on either side. I was tired, but I knew I'd reach my home in Knoxville in about 2 hours if I kept going. The hum of my old Honda Civic's engine was the only sound accompanying me on the dark highway. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He held out his thumb, his face shadowed by the dim light of my car. Normally, I wouldn't pick up hitchhikers. My wife, Amanda, always warned me about the risks, and I usually listened. But something about this guy seemed desperate, almost vulnerable. I slowed down and stopped a few feet ahead of him. The man jogged up to the passenger side, his face finally illuminated. He looked rough, unshaven, with bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks, man," he said, opening the door and sliding in. His voice was raspy, like he'd been yelling or smoking heavily. "No problem," I replied cautiously. "Where you headed?" "Knoxville," he said, pulling the door shut. I hesitated for a moment. The coincidence was unnerving, but I shrugged it off. It was a popular destination. "Lucky for you, that's where I'm headed," I said, forcing a smile. He gave me a weak grin, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I noticed his knuckles were bruised and his nails were dirty. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The man didn't say much, just stared out the window. I turned on the radio to fill the quiet, but it only seemed to make the atmosphere more awkward. "What were you doing out here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Car broke down," he said curtly, not looking at me. "Must have been out there a while," I said, glancing at his worn clothes. He didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The unease in the car was growing, but I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself that I was doing a good deed. But as the miles ticked by, the man's demeanor became stranger. "Do you ever think about what you'd do if someone tried to hurt you?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. Not really," I said, laughing nervously. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the dark trees outside. A chill ran down my spine. The road ahead was deserted, and the forest on either side seemed to close in, the tall trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. "Mind if we stop for a second?" he asked. "Stop?" I repeated, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Yeah, I need to stretch my legs, he said, turning to look at me for the first time since he got in. His eyes were dark and intense, almost predatory. I hesitated but nodded. All right, there's a rest stop a few miles up. No, he said sharply. Here is fine. I swallowed hard but pulled over. The man got out, stretching his arms and taking a deep breath. He walked to the front of the car, his figure silhouetted against the headlights. Something about the way he stood there made my heart race. Suddenly, he turned back toward the car, a slow, deliberate motion. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out something shiny. A knife. Get out of the car, he said, his voice calm but firm. My blood ran cold. What do you want? I stammered, my hands frozen on the wheel. Out, he repeated, stepping closer. Adrenaline kicked in and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, throwing the man off balance. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumble but quickly start running after me. I drove as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. But just as I thought I'd escaped, the unimaginable happened. The engine sputtered and died. No, 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 I yelled, frantically turning the key. The car refused to start. I glanced in the mirror and saw him jogging down the road, the knife glinting in his hand. With no other options, I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the car, sprinting into the forest. The trees were dense, the ground uneven, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Come back, he shouted, his voice echoing in the night. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out, but fear kept me going. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. A road. I burst out onto the pavement, waving my arms wildly. A truck screeched to a halt, the driver, a burly man in a flannel shirt, jumping out. What the hell happened to you? He asked, his eyes wide. There's a man, I gasped. He's chasing me. The driver grabbed a flashlight and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. Get in, he said, ushering me into the truck. As we sped off, I looked back at the forest. The man was standing at the edge, his figure barely visible in the darkness. He didn't move, didn't chase us, just stood there, watching. When I got to Knoxville, I reported the incident to the police. They searched the area but found no trace of him. No abandoned car, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every time I drive that stretch of Route 129, I can't help but check my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for his next ride.